How's it going? How's the motivation going to continue to make these films which are designed to annoy and ignite?
They're not designed to annoy. They're designed to inform.
Okay. And how do you feel at this
and
stage?
And informing people can annoy those who should be annoyed. Okay. That's very important.
I just want to get to a couple of things on the record, just to clear up, I think, some misconceptions about you, in fairness.
Depends, you'll have to put up your sources here, because I don't take generalisations, as you would know.
Absolutely. I mean, watching the film, The Coming War on China, one could get the impression that you're anti-American.
What's that mean?
Yeah, that's a good question, because you're not anti-American.
What's that mean?
Anti-American means always looking for a way to fault the United States policy.
Anti-Australian? I've lived in Britain for many years. Anti-British? What's that? I tell you when the anti was last used. It was used during the 1930s when they used to talk about anti-German. Mm-hmm. And we know who was running Germany then.
Yes.
So if you criticise that particular regime, you were anti-German.
Right.
Noam Chomsky makes that point when he's sometimes sometimes asked rather, as an American, how come he's anti-American? Well, he says it's ridiculous. I can go on from there, which probably fills in. I think all my work has been about the imposition of power on ordinary people. The greatest power in the world in my lifetime has been the United States. Now, I've also made films about the communist bloc when the Soviet Union was going, about Britain in its position as a sort of number two to the great power, but really the greatest power in the world in terms of politically, militarily, and even culturally is the United States. And the imposition of that power is indeed a constant theme. Now, when that power changes, I doubt whether it will in my lifetime, then we'll move on to the next power.
Right. Would there be another 2 or 3 misconceptions about John Pilger that drive you batty?
No, I don't be bothered. Let's talk about the film.
Now, congratulations. It's a very entertaining film. You are just so accomplished at cutting together archival footage and interviews. It's an entertaining film. Whether you buy into the premise or not, you still know how to construct the film to make it entertaining, especially, Mr. Pilger, over a 2-hour period, which is tough to pull off.
And this one is the first one I've done in chapters.
Oh, yes.
So, in other words, it has an overarching theme, but with 4 chapters throughout the film.
Now, just describe for us the premise of the film.
Well, the premise of the film is that American policy quietly, and I use that word advisedly, quietly changed around about 2009, when the Obama administration, heavily influenced by the politically late Hillary Clinton, who was then Secretary of State, decided it was time to face off China. And they brought in something called the Pivot to Asia, under which 2/3 of all US naval forces would be transferred to the Asia Pacific with the target as China. Now, why they would bother is something of a mystery, because already there were 400 US bases surrounding China, all the way from this country up to Okinawa, Japan, across Eurasia, like a giant noose around China. But they wanted to up the ante. China was rising, had risen, like no other power has risen, within the space of a generation, had become the world's second biggest economic power. And the top dog, the United States, was feeling rather insecure. Its dominance was at risk. Not militarily, there's nothing that can match the US militarily, but in terms of manufacturing, the US has given up on manufacturing. In terms of the things that comprise, that we can touch, comprise an economic power rather than a financial power, the US is not that power anymore. So this was the beginning of the US trying to reclaim its dominance in the world. There are many other strands to this. So I thought at the time no one was really talking about China as an enemy. I mean, it was ridiculous, really. China is where we had our T-shirts made and other rather more serious things. China was the great new trader. Why would it possibly be a military enemy? But the US was already putting in play this notion of China as its new enemy. So that's the genesis of this film over 2 years. And thanks, unfortunately, in one respect, to President Trump, who made China one of his campaign issues. He seems to have a real problem with China. I mean, he accused China of raping America, of stealing its jobs, of destroying its economy, and so on. You know, nothing about American multinationals like Apple simply disappearing to southern China to make things cheaply.
Yeah, because you went to China, and it's there in the film, and you make a very strong case that there's nothing to fear from China. That basically China has this veneer of communism under which there is a thriving market economy that loves commerce, that loves profit, and that loves the West. Mm-hmm. So you actually make a very powerful point that China is not the thing to worry about. I think perhaps a bit more alarmist is the point that America is somehow the bully that is like spoiling for a fight with China. Yet if there's all that commerce there, surely it might be just America showing its muscle in the region. But the idea of them wanting to go to war, which you do kind of stress, including...
No, I don't say they want to go to war. In fact, there are a number of Americans who knock that down. Why should they want to go to war? The point is that wars begin accidentally, usually, and a big war very likely to begin mistakenly. But America, because its great power, as I've explained, is military, has that to threaten China with. It can't threaten what it doesn't make anymore, but it can threaten its military. So it's dealing in threats. Now, what do the Chinese do when it's threatened? They have to prepare. And as people have said to me in China, why would we want to be America's enemy? Why would we want to invite a nuclear attack? But if America ordains us as an enemy, then we have to prepare. And what they've done in the last couple of years, for example, is change their nuclear weapons policy from low alert to high alert. That means the warheads and the missiles are now together. And that is all a consequence of what I've described as the pivot to Asia. Now, neither the United States nor China wants a nuclear war. Why would they? As deranged, though there are some generals in the Pentagon that get very close to being deranged, and there always have been. That may be because the United States really hasn't fought a great power since the Second World War. It's had to deal with usually small defenseless countries. But that atmosphere of distrust and of threats and of provocation is easily created. First World War began with like that.
Because the film does succeed in jolting you out of your comfort zone. I mean, we all are very comfortable with China, very happy that the Chinese film market is now growing at a pace that it's going to be the biggest film market by 2020. They love American films, they love American culture, and there you are throwing up the nuclear winter scenario again. And we could have lived the rest of our lives without seeing that again.
Well, they don't want it either. That's the last thing they want. One has pointed out, why should we want it? Well, you know, most of the elite has been educated at Harvard and Berkeley and all of that. But first and foremost, they're Chinese. Why would they want to love their country? You see, behind this lies a great unspoken. And the great unspoken is that the greatest threat to us, certainly during most of my lifetime, has been unbridled power from Washington. And the greatest threat to us understanding that is our inability to look in the mirror and always blame them, the Chinese, the Russians, throw in the Iranians, the Iraqis, terrorism, the pronoun terrorism, that's a threat in whatever form it comes, but we never look back on ourselves. And it's quite interesting, one of the interviewees is a very articulate man called Eric Lee in Shanghai. He's an entrepreneur and he's also a social scientist.
He's the one who said that the interdependence of commerce between the United States and China speaks to peace, not war.
Absolutely. He said speaks to peace. Doesn't work without peace. But he also said that the whole idea of the United States and China at war becomes almost an absurdity. It breaks the whole cycle of the prosperity that lies at the base of the most positive elements in the country. He also said that China is in effect an image of the United States. Not quite, because he argues quite convincingly that China, as he says, isn't a capitalist country, but it's a market country. In one sense, he's right. But the point he's making is that the United States and China, no two nations, he says, have more in common than the two of them. And he articulates that extremely well, but I heard that often in China.
Now, you've gone to a great deal of effort to really balance the film. So I want to make that really clear, that any sensible, objective, independent thinking person watching the film can actually see that it's a very balanced film. Having said that, I wanted to just raise with you the issue of editorial emphasis. And I want to put it in this way. I reckon I could take your film and re-edit the footage without leaving anything out. But I could re-edit the film, lay in a new narration, and release a film called Nothing to Worry About with China and Nuclear War, and re-edit it that way.
Well, you can re-edit anything too. You can rewrite Shakespeare and turn his sonnets upside down too. I'm not quite sure the point there, but
the point being is that you're emphasising a worst case scenario, and
I don't think the film does. I don't think it represents a worst case scenario at all. In fact, it represents an extremely hopeful scenario. And the very thing that you quoted, Eric Lee at the end, saying the relationship between China and the United States speaks to peace. And much of the film is given over to ordinary people actually speaking to peace in their own countries, standing up to great power, resisting great power. That's a very positive and very hopeful situation, especially when it's viewed from a country like this, where most people are disenchanted with politics. In the United States, they've just elected a president because they are disenchanted with the status quo. So I don't agree. I think the film in fact, that's why you couldn't do as you've suggested, re-edit it and put another narration on it. I like your chutzpah. Or not. And the film ends on a very hopeful note, except with the warning, the very clear warning coming from those like Stephen Starr, who's had a direct line to people, scientists in the White House and so on, who says that if we don't speak to peace, then that fear that we used to articulate extremely well, that fear that we used to protest in a very civilized way years ago, and which we appear to have forgotten, that is the fear of nuclear war, will be back.
Is it possible that there is an irony operating with the ascent of Donald Trump, that under all his bluster and contradictory blurtings, that his love of commerce, and because of the increased amount of scrutiny on him and his behaviour, and how the notion of checks and balances has been dialed up to 11 because everyone is watching every single thing he does, that in a way his election has made the likelihood of a war between China and America even less likely?
I mean, if you want to put an argument there isn't that a war between the United States and China is less likely, I would probably agree with you. But it's also likely if the current tensions and the current provocations proceed the way they do. It's gone from being a remote possibility to a possibility, at very least. So it could go either way. I'm not a futurist, and the film actually doesn't predict exactly that there will be a war between the US and China. It says, and I say right at the beginning of the film, that China and the United States may well be on the road to war. Now that's qualified because none of us can say what's in the future, but the fact that that sensible people and informed people in both countries, people like those I interviewed, sober-thinking people, as one of them said, that's an understatement, when I turned round to him, and that was a former chief scientific officer to the US Navy's head of operations, now a professor at MIT. I said, almost incredulously what he was saying, but that's a great risk. He said that's an understatement. So we're all guessing here, aren't we? We're speculating about something that we weren't speculating about 5 years ago.
How important were the crowdfunders in the making of this film?
Well, the film went broke at least 3 times.
How often has that happened in your career?
Not as much as with this one. It's the hardest thing in making a film is to raise the money. I find it exhausting. In fact, I find myself, if I'm not thinking about the iniquities of digital equipment, I'm thinking about the iniquities of raising money and being a kind of supplicant. It's difficult.
Was this
And
the hardest,
I'm
sorry, was this the hardest film?
This was the hardest one to raise money for. Not because the subject, people welcomed the subject. This is when I explained it to them and gave them the synopsis and so on. But these are hard times for billionaires and foundations and other rich people. So who allow some of their fortune to perhaps do good work and help make films. So in some desperation, we turn to the people who have followed my work over years. I was very reluctant to do this. In fact, I opposed it. I was very reluctant to crowdfund because it didn't seem right to me to ask ordinary people to cough up to major productions. But we had to, and what I found really encouraging, if not inspiring, was that the people who gave modest amounts, not so modest amounts, gave it in the spirit of wanting to have a part in the film. They were very generous in their spirit. So it was the fastest crowdfunding in Britain of its kind ever. We raised $100,000 in about 6 weeks.
And how long did it take to make the film, from soup to nuts?
So 2 years.
Nuts, 2 years. And you keep throwing yourself into the fray.
You
could be taking...
It's a good way of describing filmmaking as the fray.
Yeah. I'm presuming that you could get a job on a TV news service.
No, I don't think so. I don't think they'd hire me, no. I've made films. One of my subjects is the media. One of my most successful films, that is one of my most popular films, was called The War You Don't See.
Yes.
And it was about how the media beat the drums of war and helped start the invasion of Iraq in 2003. So I don't know. I don't want to work for television news anyway.
But you do keep throwing yourself into the fray, into the increasingly difficult world of making documentaries. At 77, I'm just going to ask you why. Why do you keep doing it? I mean...
Well, why not? Why do you do what you do?
Well, because I love it, because it's fun, because I think it makes a little difference. 1, 2,
3... you've answered for me.
Well,
why should anyone stop? It doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, I know. But no thoughts of taking it a bit easy?
What's taking it easy? This is all ageist rubbish you're talking, isn't it? Hey? No thoughts of taking it a bit easy there, John. I mean, after all these years of provoking and all that.
Just saying,
You've got your answer.
I've caused enough trouble. I'm just going to put my feet up and just live off the royalties. Never thought of doing
living off the royalties. Tell me about that.
Well, you could
what royalties do I live off? The royalties pay for the film. There is no money in making documentaries.
And how do you live? Do you live?
Well, I've been a journalist, as you pointed out, for some considerable period, and that's how I live, yeah. But I wouldn't be, if I was starting out now, in my 20s, I wouldn't be able to afford to make these films. I subsidise them. I lend to the production. I don't make money out of them, and that's fine by me, but I wouldn't be able to do that as a young person starting out, trying to build a career and also to start a family and so on. It's money governs too many good things.
Has your attitude to the impact of film changed over the years? I mean, when we're young, we're all gung-ho and wanting to change the world, and we make a film and we'll think this will make a difference. As we get older,
I don't think like that. I think like an old-fashioned journalist. That's what I am.
Okay, as
a journalist, I think like as the great American war correspondent Martha Gellhorn said, that a good journalist thinks from the ground up, not from the top down. Most journalism these days is from the top down. That is, represents power.
Yeah. Oh.
And that's why I make the films. It's not about changing the world. It's not up to me to change the world. People do that.
It's about the general concept of the impact that films can have on changing minds. Do they in fact change minds, or do they rather cement people in their existing belief systems?
Well, the assumption in your question is that they cement people in there, and that's absolute rubbish. They don't. What they do, I can't measure. It's impossible.
Well,
for many films, except some. Mm-hmm. Several of my films have had significant effects. My film on Cambodia, Year Zero, my film on East Timor, and my film on thalidomide children and others have had a very clear consequence. Now, none of that was really expected and always surprised me. Other films, they're about ideas, such as the one I mentioned, The War You Don't See, is about journalism, about the media. I don't know what the effect of that film was. The last film I did about utopia, which was the fourth film I made about Indigenous people in this country, well, I think probably its greatest effect was that it gave many Indigenous people a sense that they weren't alone. And that's why so many of them, all over Australia, came to see it. That something they knew, they weren't seeing anything new on the film, was there as a film, altogether one story. I think giving them that modicum of encouragement is good enough for me. It may have also helped to encourage the notion of a treaty. I don't know. The point is, if you claim a piece of work, such as a film, has a really important consequence, if you claim that without evidence, you're on very shaky ground. We don't know.
Can I just offer you a small challenge to something that you said about the impact of documentaries, and respectfully, the example that I often look to is Fahrenheit 9/11, which was an anti-Bush movie, and which was made shortly after Bush was elected. Now that film was a lightning rod for opposition to George W. Bush. Every celebrity, every person with any sort of platform who didn't like Bush rallied behind the film. The film won an Oscar, was credited with changing the documentary genre into something that was actually viable in the cinema. So it had, in certain regards, a huge impact. However, it didn't stop George W. Bush from getting re-elected with a bigger majority. So,
well, with the help of some very dodgy dealings in the state of Ohio, I wouldn't have thought with a huge majority.
Nonetheless, in terms of preaching to.
But why are you suggesting that one piece of work, such as that film, should change everything? What a responsibility! And who gave it? Who invested this responsibility in that film? Got an Oscar, yes, but if it at best, it's one of the components in perhaps changing the minds or influencing people or helping to put certain issues on an agenda. things happen slowly. All those people who marched on February the 16th, 2003 around the world, in London, there were the 2 or 3 million people marched and so on. Quite a few of them later on said, I marched for one day, and they still went ahead and invaded. Well, you have to march for more than one day. You have to march for many days, and you have to make many films. It's a drip effect, always.
John Pilger, which of your films has affected you personally the most?
I can't say. That's a bit. That's.
I
understand why you're asking it,
yes.
but
Well,
but all my to say one more than another. There are particularly vivid memories and examples, but they don't compete with each other. I mean, the films I've made undoubtedly in Australia about Indigenous people have, because I've gone back to the subject over many, many years, I think have probably, from an early age, had a very enduring effect on me, and I hope show in the films, because it's the Indigenous life, Indigenous culture, Indigenous people, and the Indigenous land itself are the only thing that's unique about this country. The rest is all derivative, shipped in from Essex and the United States and wherever. But that's unique. That's unique, and and the denial of that uniqueness, I suppose, has informed all those films, which have probably. Another way of putting it, I met some of the Australians I most admire in making those films. And I was talking to one of my colleagues when we were making Utopia, and we were discussing this. And I said, we're meeting, and he had done work with me, Alan Lowry, he'd worked with me, another Australian, on previous films about Indigenous people in this country. And that was the common thread, that we'd met these extraordinary people in Indigenous culture, unrecognised. And that's probably had the most effect in many ways.
Are you encouraged by other documentary filmmakers, or do you fear that you might be the last of a breed?
Last of a breed. Sometimes feels, when you're slogging down the money-raising trail, that you are the last of a breed. It's very hard to get funding for documentaries, as all documentary makers know.
And you said before that if you were a young person now that you wouldn't.
I don't think I'd not for subjects like this. You would get them for. They'd have a built-in sponsorship somewhere. Maybe do a bit of a deal with Google and or something. They'd have to appeal to the commercial world, perhaps in some way. They may have to have a touch of the so-called reality genre about them. I don't know.
I have to ask you, just in general terms, your reflections on the media right now and on what appears to be a freefall of standards, even in mainstream media. The fact that the term fake news is being thrown around so much.
Yeah, but fake news is an invention. The term is an invention to really, I think, disguise the fact that in the mainstream media there is fake news. That's the main source of fake news. It's not on social media. We know about social media. Of course, there's fakery all over it. There's also some extraordinary journalism. When I get up in the morning, I don't lift up a newspaper anymore. And as one trained as a newspaper man, that always seems to me extraordinary. I log on. and I know where to go for some of the finest journalism.
Where do you go?
I go to, for example, Consortium News, which is run by a great American journalist called Bob Parry in Washington, the man who uncovered the Iran Gate scandal. I go to the Information Clearinghouse, another American site. Interestingly, most of the best sites, the best journalism sites, are in the United States. I go to Counterpunch. Most of these sites, interestingly, are not known to journalists when I mention them, and yet they have writing for them some of the most distinguished journalists, people like Gareth Porter, a wonderful reporter. He doesn't write in print anymore, probably because there is no one that will take his work.
Is the impending death of print? Is it?
Well, it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be, should it? I mean, why people? It's like saying the impending death of the cinema. That's been going on since the cinema began, and it didn't die. It survived television, and the same is true since the printing press began its wondrous produce of thoughts and words and everything that is so important to our culture. I don't think so. I think books actually are rather healthy. They have to be protected from the big beast, but that was perhaps always the case. Newspapers, but then I've got to the point, there are some newspapers, I don't care if they survive or not, frankly. Why should I care if Murdoch's son dies? Unfortunately, I don't think it will. So I won't mention others, with all respect.
You mentioned how you're constantly on the line financially when making a film,
yes.
And then it's getting harder.
Yes.
You have an outstanding website, johnpilger.com.
Yes.
On which all of your films are available for free.
That was my decision. Put them up, let people see them.
Not even charge $1 a film?
No.
Why?
Because I want people to see the films. I don't make films to make money. I make films to, I hope, inform people. Simple as that. And why should they have to struggle through the quagmire of some platform or other, putting in a couple of bucks to see a film, so that I can add it as change. But perhaps it's unwise of me. I should charge for the films, and that would make the next film. But why? You know, the films go back to 1970. I'm delighted they've been remastered. That, you know, at a click of a mouse, you can see work that was made on film, often in very difficult circumstances many years ago. I find that absolutely wondrous.
And as soon as you could, you were putting your films on YouTube for free too, weren't you?
Well, no, they shouldn't. No, we keep hauling them down from YouTube.
But wasn't there a John Pilger channel?
Yes, yeah, it's not. It shouldn't be there. I sometimes look the other way, but they shouldn't be on YouTube because the production company I make my films for in the UK, Dartmouth Films, is a wholly admirable documentaries production company. It's got to make a living, so we keep an eye on YouTube. Yeah.
Hey, can I ask you one other question?
Yeah.
What do you enjoy? What makes you? What do you?
Well, I enjoy making films.
Okay, apart from the making of films and dealing with power
But
structures.
but no, it's not that. Making films the whole life, isn't it? It's about travel. It's about privilege of meeting lots of people I wouldn't meet if I was sitting in Sydney or London. Right?
But do you have a hobby or
a hobby,
pastime or an
a hobby like stamp collecting or something.